Welcome to the Gnostic Informant. I'm Jesus, the Logos incarnate, and you are about to attain true Gnosis.
Welcome back to the Gnostic Informant, and you are about to attain true Gnosis. And I'm with the popular demanded Justin Sledge of Esoterica, Ph.D. in philosophy, and just a well-read, well-rounded person when it comes to all this ancient stuff, all this philosophy, religions, everything. You're one of the best out there, so I'm really happy to have you on here, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, man. Thank you so much for having me on. It's been just a lot of fun to get to know you and Derek better and hang out with you guys. Super smart folks who ask great questions, have great audiences. So folks out there, I'm really glad to connect with all of y'all. So thank you for having me on.
Absolutely. And if anyone has any super chats, you can feel free to submit those. We have some questions from some Patreons we'll start off with, and then we'll go from there. And number one is from VK Daman. And yeah, it's a little bit longer than I could fit, so I'll read it from the email. It says, ancient people seem to think of heaven as connected to our world and that a person can travel to it if only they could somehow fly up there. Modern believers seem to think of heaven more like another dimension and not part of our material cosmology. Does Dr. Sledge know when the alternate dimension conception evolved, and who were some of the thinkers responsible for the transition? Thank you for the super chat.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question because I like the idea of trying to locate where heaven is. And I think by extension also trying to locate where hell is, which is an interesting question as well. I love the images of sort of Dante's worldview, right? Where it's like sort of directly beneath Jerusalem. Yeah, you get this really layered reality. And the idea that you could travel to there bodily, heaven that is at least, and hell I suppose too, was an idea that's found not only in sort of Second Temple period Judaism, but you see it also in Zoroastrianism. In fact, there's a pretty famous Zoroastrian text where a person goes on a tour of hell, very much prefiguring Dante's Divine Comedy. It's a neat, relatively short piece of Zoroastrian literature. And there's also another thing just to comment about that is that one of the things that always struck me when I read the New Testament as a young person, there was this idea that my Christian friends had told me that Jesus was omniscient, that he knew all the things because he was God. And there was a moment where it says that he looked up to the heavens to his Father. And I was like, if Jesus knew everything, right, he would have known that it's just like space up there. And so it just struck me as weird. And, there's a famous moment where Yuri Gagarin, right, the Soviet cosmonaut, goes to space and he says, I've been to the heavens and I saw no God, as somehow proof of Soviet atheism or something. Which is sort of a glib kind of glib. So different than when we went to space, right? We're reading the book of Genesis, it's like really Christian heavy, whereas the Soviets get up there and they're like, look around, there's no God. So they're like, yep, atheism. Um, it's like how two people can see completely different things.
Wow.
But
Yeah.
but I think to get to the question, when did sort of this idea that heaven's an alternative dimension? Um, I have never heard that. I guess I don't travel in many circles in which heaven, in Judaism at least, heaven, the world to come, Olam Haba, is not another world. It's just a better version of this world. It's a reformed version of this one. So it's not somewhere else that's somewhere else. But the idea of alternative dimensions really emerges in the 19th century. It emerges primarily first in mathematics, in the mathematical development of algebraic topography, where we begin to understand that space and time are two dimensions of reality, and that one begins to wonder if there are other dimensions of reality. And the most famous exploration of that would be probably in the mid 19th century. And then you get the famous Flatland novel that explores what would it be like if you were a one-dimensional being,
Oh yeah.
where you have only height or width, but not depth or something like that. And so I think the idea that heaven would be another dimension has to emerge in the 20th century, because the mathematics behind other dimensions don't even exist until the 19th century, and no one's really popularly thinking about that until the rise of science fiction, really, primarily in the early 20th century and the mid 20th century, where you begin to see the proliferation of that kind of idea and sort of weird fiction and stuff like that, popular science fiction, suppose. So I would say this is a really recent idea. Now, there are some debates in physics, and I don't want to stray too far into physics because I'm not a physicist, and I think that people who talk about physics without having a really good understanding of that stuff are full of it. And so I don't want to be one of those people. But
Sure.
the dimensions that you talk about in, for instance, like quantum mechanics or string theory and stuff like that, and I have very little to say about string theory that's positive, but those dimensions are real little. And there's no room for heaven in any of those dimensions. So even if the string theory is true and you get 10 dimensions of reality, those other dimensions are really little, and fitting a whole heaven in there is going to be a hell of a hard thing to do. So I don't think that string theory or something is going to be your friend for trying to make your metaphysics work to get an afterlife out of the deal. So that we got 2 cents about that. Not that, again, it's really 1 cent. I have to be really careful about how many cents you can put into my physics knowledge. But I would say this idea that heaven or wherever is an alternate dimension, hell too, right? And I think hell is really popularly done in the movie Event Horizon, where hell is sort of a different dimension, right? They get a spaceship and they jump into lights. They create an artificial black hole, whatever, and sends them to hell. That's the opposite version from the movie Event Horizon, which is a great 90s space horror movie.
Right.
But I think that has to originate primarily in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Just the math alone it only dates to then. No one in the Middle Ages was thinking that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I think you made a good point, because once all these new quantum physics theories come out, all of a sudden there's these new gaps that people can look at.
Yeah.
Like we don't understand string theory, but maybe it's in there. We don't understand that before the Big Bang. It's always in the gaps.
Right.
So
the God of the gaps. Yeah, the God of the gaps. If you get more gaps, you get more God.
Yeah.
And now string theory is proven to be. I think that there's good reason to believe it's not science.
You're right.
Actually, there's good arguments against it.
Yeah.
Hassendorfer has really great arguments against it. In her book, it has some really great arguments against it. And but yeah, I think if you're a person of faith, and I don't want to speak for people of faith too much, but I will say that if you're a person of faith, if you're trying to fit your God into the gaps of science, it just seems like you're playing a losing game.
Right.
It just that game is a losing game in the end, and I don't understand what exactly is motivating the impulse behind that. Because, why should God have to play by the rules of physics or something?
I agree.
Yeah,
I totally 100% agree.
Any kind of God that I would be willing to believe in is just not gonna.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna. Oh, God has to fit heaven to one of the 8th dimension. I'm like, why?
What? Right.
Why does God have to do that?
Yeah. That's a good answer. Thank you for that. And number 2 is from Sherry Duckett. Could you ask Dr. Sledge if he has studied esoteric biochemistry? And what can you tell us about the current state of alchemy?
Yeah, so I don't know what esoteric biochemistry is. I just don't know what that is. Maybe like.
I think she meant alchemy.
Yeah, maybe biofeedback or something. I'm not sure quite what that is. So the current state of alchemy, I guess I can say two things about that. The first thing is that alchemy has largely undergone a shift in the past couple hundred years away from laboratory alchemy, which is to say the attempt to engage in fundamental or substantial transmutation. Most famously, the attempting to turn a base metal into gold or silver. Very, very few alchemists are trying to do that anymore. What's happened is that beginning in the 18th century and mostly in the 19th century, alchemy underwent a kind of romantic reimagining where people no longer are really interested in the alchemists trying to transform lead into gold. What they really were interested in is alchemy as a kind of spiritual transformation of the human being, or a psychological transformation of one's psyche, in the Jungian analysis of alchemy. And so what's happened with alchemy are two things. One is that transition's happened. When most people talk about alchemy, they talk about what we might call inner alchemy, which is basically a kind of a spiritual self-help using metaphors taken from historical alchemy as signs of that progression. So that's one thing that's happened. The other thing that's happened in alchemy is that historians of alchemy have realized that interpretation of alchemy is ahistorical, which is to say medieval alchemists, Hellenistic alchemists, alchemists in the Islamic period were actively trying to transmute base metals into gold. And not just that, they were developing medicines, they were developing paint. I mean, if you've ever seen paint in the Middle Ages, someone had to make that.
Right.
And, it's not easy to make paint. I mean, developing pigments and stuff like that. So if you've ever had a glass of whiskey, someone has to distill that. You have to figure out how distillation works.
Yeah.
And that's science at some level, or what we would now recognize as science. And so what we're doing now in the study of alchemy is that rather than looking at these alchemical books and going, oh, that's just a bunch of crazy conjuration nonsense, sorcery, what we're doing now, and you can see it in the background of my room there, I have a small distilling flask, because I'm also interested in this.
Yeah.
And what we're doing now is we're going back and forensically recreating what the alchemists did. And what we're finding is they were very careful experimentalists. They weren't just randomly tossing in salamanders and whatever and be like, hocus pocus, mumbo jumbo, please get me rich with gold.
Like in Skyrim, the game Skyrim.
Yeah, it's nothing like that. They really were experimentalists, and they were actively doing things where they were really trying with the theories of the universe they had at the time, which happened to be wrong, but they were really trying to hone in on the idea that, look, if all metals are fundamentally some combination or some ratio of mercury and silver, which is what they thought they were. They thought all metals were some combination of mercury and silver. Paracelsus thought there was salt in there too, but we can leave Paracelsus over there. But they thought that all metals are some combination of these, and that the combination of those with various kinds of pressures inside the earth and astrological pressures coming down from the stars, if you were to subject those two substances to those pressures, then various metals emerge. Lead, tin, silver, gold. And the idea is that deep in the earth, these forces manipulate sulfur and metal and produce the various kinds of metals. Well, the idea is, if you took a metal and then you decomposed it back into sulfur and metal, what you would ultimately get are sulfur and metal. You would get sulfur and mercury. You would get these two fundamental substances that make up all metals according to their theory. And the idea was, if nature produces gold and silver and tin and lead by various kinds of pressures on the ratio of sulfur and mercury, what nature can do by nature, we can do by art, which means we could do it in a lab and we could do it faster.
Yeah.
And so the idea is you take metal, decompose it back into sulfur and mercury, and then you recompose it with all kinds of various pressures and various kinds of astrological configurations. And then you could basically convert any metal back into sulfur and mercury, and then take that base and reconvert it back into gold or silver or whatever. It's completely reasonable.
Yeah.
It's a very reasonable theory.
It sounds like, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And so finally, the thing I would say about that is that we now have their records. We have their laboratory. We have Newton's laboratory books. We have many alchemists' laboratory books going back for centuries. And what we do is we can recreate their experiments and see just how their mind was working. And what we realize is they were very careful experimentalists. So one of the cool things that has dropped out of alchemical research in the past 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, is that we no longer have to believe that the alchemists were just sort of bumbling around in the dark, mixing and matching various kinds of whatever trash they were developing and trying to summon angels to fix things. They were careful experimentalists. And sublimation, distillation. Alchemists develop sulfuric acid. They develop nitric acid. They develop hydrochloric acid. And if you've ever been in a lab and taken chemistry 101 or 201 probably, and you've had to prepare your own sulfuric acid or hydrochloric acid, that's not easy. You cannot prepare hydrochloric acid by accident. Like, you're just not going to randomly do that. And so the fact that they were able to generate things like hydrochloric acid, sulfuric acid, they were able to create distillations. One of the things the alchemists became really famous for in the 17th century especially was many of them gave up on trying to transmute lead into gold because there was actually a far more profitable business that they could engage in. And that was producing very high quality potassium nitrate. Potassium nitrate, to create it, you can create it in a lab and you create really, really pure potassium nitrate. Why? Because potassium nitrate was worth its weight in gold. Why? Because you take potassium nitrate and you mix it with a little bit of sulfur, or equal parts sulfur and equal parts charcoal, and guess what you get? You get gunpowder. And when you take gunpowder and put it in a tube and point it at someone, they give you gold, it turns out. So you don't have to turn lead into gold. You just got to turn potassium nitrate into a gun, and then you get the gold.
Wow.
So many alchemists are like, I'm not going to try to do crazy, turn lead to gold. Just make potassium nitrate for the local prince. And as long as I keep pumping out the gold, he can keep, blowing people up, and I'm employed. So these become the first DoD contractors. They're basically alchemical DoD contractors that are working in various courts through Europe, producing very high quality potassium nitrate. So we now understand the alchemists in a way that rescues them from I think really poor misunderstandings of what they were up to. So the current state of alchemy is we are in a great position to understand them now far better than we were ever before. The big barrier is just getting people to do the work of translating their literature and then recreating their experiments in modern labs, which is a bunch of fun.
And the way you describe it just now, I'm thinking these are like the proto-chemist.
Yeah.
And which, in, like you said, they're making gunpowder and they're funding wars and becoming very rich because this is a profitable thing. You can go and sack a city or something. Yeah. But not even that long ago, not even a century ago, World War II, there was chemists that were making nuclear bombs and atomic bombs doing the same exact thing, but on a higher level. So it's like, I'm not saying that it's just an evil thing, but I'm saying what came out of that is basically the soil for science, basically.
Sure.
Which is a double-edged sword.
Of course, yeah. I mean, science didn't come out of nowhere. I mean, there's this sort of, sometimes we tell a story where the scientists were like, "Oh, then Newton popped out of nowhere, and then science happened."
Yeah,
that never happened. Science is insofar as it is a method of doing experiments by which we try to understand and manipulate reality. That's always been around. Always been around. So yeah, I think that I think it's a poor understanding of alchemy that we've inherited, and thank God now we have really great historians and chemists working together to recreate alchemical history, and we're now realizing these people were a lot smarter than we gave them credit for.
Absolutely. All right, thank you for that. And the third question is, I would love to get Dr. Sledge's take on when Jewish mysticism first began. By the way, while we're at it, not to be cheap or anything, but just for time purposes, Yakuvi has dropped a 9.99 super chat. Says, when did Kabbalah originally take off? I just noticed this, and I think the two are kind of related. Maybe we can, unless you want to separate them.
Yeah, we can try to take them on both at the same time,
because I think they're related, right?
They're related, yeah.
Okay.
So the Kabbalah, so I'll say the Kabbalah. So the easy answer is the second one. When did Kabbalah originally take off? Well, it first developed in southern France, in the area of Provence, and in Spain, in the area mostly in the Castile region. And it begins to develop with the Sefer Bahir sometime around the early part of the 11th century, but it's really in the 13th century, around 1370, that the Sefer Zohar is composed by Moshe de Leon and the circle of people around him. That's in Castile, and we date it to roughly 1270, but give or take, 30 years, whatever. But that's when it developed. We think that primarily until from the 1270s, when the Sefer Zohar was written down, to the Alhambra decree in 1492, the Kabbalah was mostly a very esoteric, very elite school of Jewish mysticism that was only known in very, very tight circles. But what happened is that in 1492, with the Alhambra decree, the Jews were expelled. Basically, many Jews were expelled from Spain for not converting to Christianity. And many Kabbalists took that as a sign of the imminent restoration of Israel via the Messiah. And they held that the unveiling of the Kabbalah was going to be crucial in that process. And so rather than maintaining their Kabbalah cards tied to their chest prior to 1492, after 1492, they began to popularize Kabbalah as part of what they took to be the final redemption of human beings. So they really thought that the Messiah was about to come and everything was about to be done with. So there was enormous uptick in the Jewish world in the aftermath of 1492, that what was about to happen was the Messiah was going to come imminently, and the Kabbalah was sort of like the red carpet being rolled out for him. And so the Kabbalah develops in the 13th century. It's popularized, or to use your language, it takes off primarily in the aftermath of the 1492 Alhambra decree. Well, then, as I'm sure folks know, there's the entire mess with Shabbatai Tzvi, the false Messiah who ultimately converts to
1666.
1666, which, by the way, is the exact same year that Newton discovers the laws of physics, the nature of light, and the calculus. So it's always interesting that Shabbatai Tzvi is converting the same time that Newton's basically figuring out how the universe works at some level. Which I always find that to be really, that year, that it's just a fascinating year.
Yeah.
Which is also, by the way, the year there was a huge plague in England at the time, and he had to basically figure that out in quarantine, which I think we can all relate to a little bit.
Yeah.
So at any rate, what ends up happening, and just to very briefly say what, in the aftermath of Shabbatai Tzvi, that's when you begin to get all the rules about you have to be 40 and married before you can ever study Kabbalah. Because what ends up happening is that the worry is that if we broadcast Kabbalistic ideas too broadly, we'll get another disaster like Shabbatai Tzvi. And so that's when it gets reeled back in. And it's been basically reeled back in ever since. So there's a weird period from 1492 to 1666 where they're broadcasting Kabbalah at the top of their lungs, publishing it, getting it out there, and then it kind of goes off the rails with the whole Shabbatai Tzvi thing. Now, the previous question, when did Jewish mysticism appear? That's a lot more complicated. So if by Jewish, I mean you probably think of sort of the Bible and all of Israelite literature. I would say that there are Israelite shamans as early as we have Israelite literature. The earliest prophets that we see in the Hebrew Bible are warband prophets. And they seem to go into trances. There's examples of Saul meeting some of them on the road, and they're like dancing and shouting and screaming, and they're in some kind of ecstatic state. Saul joins them in this sort of ecstatic state. So we know that there was Israelite shamanism probably as long as there have been Israelites. We just don't know much about it, because part of what the court history of Israel is going to want to do is erase a lot of that stuff, to centralize authority in the Jerusalem temple and the Jerusalem priesthood. But we traditionally begin to date Jewish mysticism as we would recognize it now with the vision of the Merkava held by Ezekiel. And that image of the Merkava, the chariot, and the Hechalot, the palaces of God, those visions, and also the vision in Isaiah, right? Because they're sort of the classic two visions, one of Ezekiel, one of Isaiah. We typically think that either those two visions spawned a literature that we now recognize as Merkava mysticism and Hechalot mysticism, or I actually tend to believe, and I may be in the minority about this, that there was already this form of mysticism uniquely situated among the priesthood, and that Ezekiel and Isaiah, their visions are so similar in some ways that to me it seems like there's already a literary topos available to them, and that they're writing it down, something that's probably been orally known within the tight circles of the Israelite, the Jerusalemite priesthood, and that they have these visions, and there's already a kind of otherworldly journey mysticism that's already at work in the priesthood, and that the Merkava Hechalot literature is downstream of that. And part of the reason why I would argue that it was already at least existing in some form by the time that Ezekiel and Isaiah are writing is that by the time the literature begins to be written down, the Merkava and the Hechalot literature, the systems are already very tight. We already have all of the core ideas available to them. and you don't see a development of the ideas. You just get this massive text, Hechelot Rabati, which if you've ever seen it before, it's a huge text.
Wow.
And because it's so huge, and Hechelot Zotarti and Second Enoch and things like this, because those texts are already highly developed literarily, that tells me that they've already gone some very long, some relatively extensive development for centuries prior, and that by the time we get these very tightly formed new texts, that these are downstream of some kind of theory and practice of mysticism. So what I would say is, I think that it probably began in the Jerusalemite temple, the first temple that is, very late in the game, 6th century maybe, and there are already otherworldly journey mysticisms going on, and that the Ezekiel and Isaiah visions are expressions of that, and the further Hechelot and Merkava mysticisms are downstream further even of that. It's also worth pointing out, just to get some time, to get some sense of time, that the Kabbalah as we know it is about 800 years old, right? So if you think about from about the end of the 13th century till now, we're talking about 800 years. The Merkava Hechelot literature, that mysticism, lasted even longer than Kabbalah has to us. So the dominant form of mysticism in the Jewish world, if you think about it historically, was Merkava Hechelot mysticism, and Kabbalah is sort of just now beginning to match in terms of the time that it has emerged into the historical situation. So you're talking about at least 800 years.
Yeah.
At least 800 years. So I would say that. So we should separate between Kabbalah, which is a very specific group of Jewish mysticisms. There's
Sure.
more than one Kabbalah, and then Jewish mysticism more broadly.
Sure.
Of which Hechelot and Merkava mysticism were a pre-form of Jewish mysticism that were eventually absorbed into Kabbalah, but are distinct from it.
And go back a lot farther.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great answer. Constellation Pegasus is dropping some cash. So I have 2 more Patreon questions that we're not going to forget about. We're going to get to those. But just because of how much this person is dropping, I feel it necessary to get to his questions. So thank you for these super chats. Constellation Pegasus, I love seeing your name on the chat. Did the Babylonian Talmud have text added as the years went by? There's some weird stuff in it, like burning black cat guts so you can see demons. Not sure if the first and second temple Jews were burning cat guts to see demons.
So the Babylonian Talmud is by definition a text in which stuff is added to it. That's what it is.
Right.
The Talmud is a commentary on the Mishnah, and so imagine a commentary on the Mishnah between a bunch of people that last 500 years. That's what the Talmud is.
It's like the ultimate Platonic dialogue between.
Yeah, the one that never ends. I mean, it's like the longest Reddit thread you can imagine.
Yeah.
So to understand the Talmud, it's better to understand the Talmud as a commentary to the Mishnah between different groups of rabbinical scholars that stretch over a period of 500, a period of about 500 years. So there's a bunch of weird stuff in there, right? And this is a really important thing to remember about the Talmud, is the Talmud is never monolithic. It never describes what all Jews believed at any moment. What we get are one rabbi says, I know some people that might do this to see demons. And a lot of the other rabbis are like, that guy's nuts.
Right. That's exactly.
Right? And they're like, that guy's not representative of the rest of us. Now, for anti-Semites, that's really useful, because what they'll do is they'll go into the Talmud to pick out the most salacious things they can find and say, well, Jews believe this.
Yep. That's what happens.
Yeah, it's what happens, right? And again, you can also go to the Hadith, right, and pick out crazy ass Hadiths that are in that literature, and there'll be crazy people that say, oh, Islam is inherently anti-Semitic because of this one Hadith. And I'm like, that is a Hadith that might not even be thought of as reliable by Muslims.
You could go to the epistles. You can go to Paul's epistles and find some stuff and take it out of context. Anything's like that.
Right. The Bible. I mean, it's all kinds of stuff. So it's really important that when people say the Talmud says, what you're really saying is, in a conversation that lasted 500 years, someone said something.
Right.
And you need to get the context. You need to get that rabbi. Is that rabbi a dominant rabbi? Is that rabbi a rabbi that the halacha, the Jewish law, even follows? Because there are many rabbis that will say things and the halacha never follows them. The law is never taken by them. So Yes. Now, what's also important, by the way, is you mentioned that the Babylonian Talmud has text added to it. Well, what's also important about it is it was censored for many, many years. There are many things in there that are not exactly pleasant that they have to say about Christians, sometimes referred to as minim, the heretics. And there's some unpleasant things that are said about this character Yeshu, which may or not have been Jesus, right? That he's being boiled in his own excrement for eternity and stuff like that. So there's some salacious things in there that could or could not be against Jesus and against Christianity. Well, those things were intentionally edited out, and it's only just now in the 21st century, really, that we actually have the Talmud without the censored parts.
Wow.
So, because it's obviously, I mean, do you want to be a Jewish person, carrying around a book that makes fun of Jesus in the 12th century? Of course you don't. Light your ass up.
Right.
And so they censored it. They self-censored it.
Yeah.
And so it's just now to the case where we're not only are we realizing how complex the Talmud is, we're actually finally being able to read it in its entirety without having to worry about censoring it for the Jewish community not to be targeted.
Okay.
So it's what's I think more interesting is not that it's the product of what's been added to it, because that's just what it is, but it's also we're finally getting it without having to worry about it being censored. And also, by the way, there's another Talmud, entirely different Talmud called the Jerusalem Talmud that is very different.
Yeah, yep.
Different.
I just recently found out they were different.
Oh,
Recently,
they're very different.
Talking to James Tabor, I used to think they were pretty much the same. I don't know where I got that from.
No, the Jerusalem Talmud is written in a different dialect of Aramaic.
Yeah,
and it's much more focused on things like agricultural issues, because the Jews living in Palestine were primarily agricultural in nature, whereas the Jews living in Babylon are much more urban.
Yep.
And so their needs and stuff are very different. But yeah, if you want to know kind of what Jesus may have sounded like, the Aramaic of the Babylonian Talmud is probably about as close as you're going to get to the kind of way he would have talked, the kind of Galilean Aramaic that he would have spoken.
So I'm going to keep going with Constellation Pegasus. He has a string of them that I'm going to get to, but I also want to just real quick, a little drive-by. Jason Sobek, Lord of the Four Corners, thank you for the super chat. I appreciate that. The next one was, this one I think is pretty interesting. One thing weird about Judaism, I don't know if you call it weird, but it is that they don't know what happens after death. Sheol is undefined. Any reason why Judaism is like that? Other religions at the time had answers for that.
Well, I think Sheol is pretty well defined. It's just crappy. It's just a dark, gloomy, cave-like afterlife. And that's it. Yeah. I mean, and there's the righteous and the bad go to the same place, with the exception of the Rephaim. The Rephaim are actually mentioned specifically as going to the worst part of Sheol, the darkest corner of it. So, but with that exception, everyone goes there. So it's not undefined. We have a pretty good idea of what Sheol was like, or at least what the Israelites thought it was like. Now, when you get to Jews, what happens is that under Zoroastrian Persian influence, you begin to get a very different afterlife that develops in the Second Temple period. In fact, Sheol is abandoned. The only people that maintain a belief in Sheol are the hardcore traditionalists that we now call the Sadducees,
right? Because
they rejected the afterlife. They thought, no, that's paganism. Like the afterlife is paganism. It's not the Torah, right? Yeah. So we don't accept this. So that's actually the correct Orthodox position. Is that there's just Sheol and that's it, and that's what the Sadducees believed.
Yeah,
it's with the adjunct of rabbinical Judaism that you begin to get a much more developed sense of the afterlife, with Olam Haba and Gehenna and all this other stuff, where Gehenna just kind of transforms into a kind of crappy afterlife, and eventually that transforms into what we would call hell. So it's not that Judaism didn't have an afterlife; it certainly does. It's not definitive in the same way that perhaps Christianity is. Although I will say that even Christianity isn't totally definitive. For instance, the Catholic Church maintained the existence of limbo for centuries. Now, the idea that unbaptized children went to a non-heaven place called limbo, where they weren't tortured. And what ends up happening with limbo? They abandoned it. The Catholic Church has officially abandoned limbo. So all those babies that are unbaptized, they get to go to heaven after all. So in the Middle Ages, limbo was one of their ideas, and eventually limbo was abandoned. So it's not even that that other mainstream Abrahamic religions have it, sorted out exactly. They're still figuring it out as much as anyone can. But yeah, I think Judaism has always I'm saying rabbinical Judaism here. Rabbinical Judaism has always had an allergy for speculation. It just doesn't indulge in it. And in
Right.
fact, the Babylonian Talmud even says, it's better not even to be born than to speculate about the beginning of the universe, the end of the universe, what happens to you when you die. It's just don't do that. When the Messiah is going to come, the end of the world. Rabbinical Judaism has an allergy for that kind of speculation because for Rabbinical Judaism, the focus of life needs to be life,
Right.
not afterlife. And there's not much of a conception of in Judaism and Rabbinical Judaism where this world's a test and this world's just a sort of a footnote on a speed bump on the way to the afterlife. This life really matters. And if you go to any Jewish celebration and someone's drinking, they're going to say l'chaim, right? To life. They're not going to say to afterlife.
That's a good point.
And so it's not that Judaism doesn't have a highly developed theory of afterlife. Judaism does. It's just there's just a general allergy to that kind of speculation. And it's not to say that there is lots of speculation about it, but at the end of the day, Judaism just doesn't. That's not its focus. It's much more worried about like, is your oven kosher? What are your plans to kosher your house for Pesach? That's what Judaism worries about to the nth degree.
Yeah.
Because if your house is kosher for Pesach, then you're okay. The rest will sort itself out. The famous answer, right? If you go ask a rabbi what happens to me when I die, like, I don't know, I'm not dead yet. I'm glad I don't know the answer to that question. So it's just a different attitude about what priority. And I think Christianity and Islam are much more interested in sort of what happens to you when you die as a form of reward or punishment. Yeah. And Judaism just doesn't conceive of the afterlife that way and is not that concerned about it.
It's interesting how the Sadducees are the ones who are like Torah observant to the core, the oldest of all the groups. They trace. I think Zadok is what the name sons of Zadok.
The Sadokim. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like, but like they're the ones that all the other modern, Islamic groups, Christian groups, or even the Pharisees have a completely different cosmology than the ones who go back the farthest. It's one of those weird things.
Religion changes. I mean, again, like you have a car long enough, you'll replace parts. And eventually you're going to replace the engine, the transmission, you're going to replace, and again, is it still the same car? Well, kind of, right? Yeah. Well, how much of a religion do you have to change to it's not the same religion? Do you have to still do animal sacrifices? Well, kind of. So, I mean, again, we get into the Theseus ship problem. And Judaism, part of the genius of Judaism, in my opinion, is that its ability to change, its ability to adapt, and to really alter itself given real-world historical circumstances. And Judaism has proven that it is capable of doing that. It's adaptable.
That's undeniable.
And again, you could say, like, the rabbinical Judaism betrayed authentic Sadducean Judaism. Did it? The Sadducees were sellouts to the Romans, and everyone hated them. Yeah. Were they the real authoritative bearers of Israelite history? The sellout, the aristocratic sellouts to the Romans?
Wow, that's a good point.
Those guys are the authentic Israelites, really?
Yeah.
So I think when you play that no true Scotsman game, you can't win that. History is just more complicated than that.
Yeah, exactly. That's the best way to put it. It's very complicated. And Constellation Pegasus says last one, and then drops $100.
Wow!
Thank you. I don't know
some cheddar. Hey, Constellation Pegasus, you got to come to my live streams.
Make sure you subscribe to Esoterica.
Drop some cheddar on the Esoteric.
Yeah. Last one. What's your opinion on the ancient Jews believing in a flat Earth and dome cosmology? 3 Baruch says the Tower of Babel was built to see if the firmament was made of stone or copper and something else to pierce it and make the waters gush out. That's telling.
Yeah, ancient. Yeah, what are my opinion of ancient Jews believing in the flat Earth? I think that they believed what probably many people at that time believed. Right. I mean, they believed what they could see, and and I think that they had a pretty limited. They were wrong. They were just wrong. I mean, the world is not a flat disc supported by pillars with a firmament on top, and there's water on top that leaks out when it rains. That's just not the way the world works. But a lot of ancient people believe a bunch of wrong things. So when I go to the Torah and I go to the Bible, I'm looking for a lot of things. I can tell you what I'm not looking for. I'm not looking for geology. I'm not looking for cosmology. I'm not looking for chemistry. I'm looking for other things. And I think that if you go to the Bible looking for cosmology and geology and geography and math, you're also going to come away believing that pi is, 3.14. It's 22/7. and because that's what the Bible thought it was, and that's not pi. So, or that days somehow magically can exist without the sun and the earth existing. I don't know what a day is aside from the relationship of the sun and the earth. So, yeah, I just don't go to the Bible looking to learn that kind of stuff from that. And um, ancient people are often wrong about a bunch of stuff. I mean, you walk into an ancient doctor's office and they're like, "Yeah, I have a cold." Well, we cut your body open and let your evil blood out, the hot blood out of your body. I'm like, yeah, they were smart in their own way, but
Plato thought that babies can travel from the womb down to the woman's leg and
yeah, I've heard
cause.
it.
Yeah, so like
No, the homuncular theory of pregnancy and stuff. I mean,
yeah,
yeah, I just don't. Yeah, I think again, it's the
doesn't
Bible.
mean they were dumb. They were smart in other areas.
Right,
You know?
or it just that I'm not expecting Plato to have everything right, or even most things. I mean, Aristotle's systematically wrong,
Right.
but he was systematically wrong. That's still progress over people who just randomly guess stuff.
Right.
At least he had a system.
That's
right?
a good point. Yeah.
But he was systematically wrong about everything. But that's still far and away an improvement.
But he was consistent within the system.
He was like,
yeah,
the system. Like it's far better than like the gods do stuff randomly.
Yeah.
That's a far better way of understanding reality, I think. So yeah, I'm just like, people say, well, the Bible thinks this. I'm like, yeah, the Bible thinks all kinds of crazy wrong stuff.
I love that attitude. It's such a good way to look at it because you're not going to be disappointed. You go into the text knowing what it is and knowing what it's not, and then you can get something from it. You get some enjoyment from it. You know?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I remember like, what is that? I was in Sunday school and I was a kid, and I remember like, all right, so Adam and Eve had some kids, and they had 3 kids, and Cain and Abel, and we know what happened to poor Abel, and they had this other son, Seth. Well, what happened to Cain? He went off and married someone. I remember asking my Sunday school teacher, who the hell did he marry? And she was like, you keep asking questions like that, you're going to become apocoros. You're going to become a heretic. Well, here I am.
Right. That's hilarious.
It didn't deter me. I'm like, yeah, I'm not going to the Bible to figure out genetics.
Right.
It's not
it's
not what I'm going there for.
Question number 4 from the Patreon is how much of this would you say is accurate about Origin and his interpretation of Scripture? I might have copied that wrong.
Yeah. So I guess I'll say just a couple things about Origin. I don't know specifically what you're interested about. Was it maybe the question is about his hermeneutic, right? That there's sort of a threefold layer of Scripture. That there's the standard reading, and there's sort of a metaphorical reading, and there's sort of the deep theological reading of Scripture. It's neat. I mean, that's sort of a precursor to the fourfold system of exegesis that you find in Christianity, and also the fourfold system of exegesis that you find also in Judaism, the so-called Pardes system. Insofar as that, I think that's interesting. I think that it's interesting that he takes what is basically a Stoic system for doing hermeneutics and then applies it to Christianity. The Stoics, and folks out there may know this, there was a big debate in the intellectual pagan world about what to do with the myths, because if you've ever read the myths, you know that they're a complete disaster. All of the gods look pretty bad. I mean, they look like rapacious, lying, cowardly, all kinds of bad. I mean, the gods look terrible from a moral point of view. And then the big theory is what to do with this. And Plato's theory about what to do with it basically was to edit out all the bad stuff. Just edit out all the stuff that was offensive and give the guardians or the auxiliaries, as he called them, give them that stuff. Right. And so he basically, in a really salacious way, argued for censorship in sort of a slice and dice way akin to what Thomas Jefferson wanted to do with the Bible, right? Just cut all the supernatural parts that he didn't agree with and make his own Bible, which he did. You can see it in the Smithsonian. It's kind of neat.
Yeah.
He literally cut and pasted like with a razor blade.
The parts that he liked.
the parts that agree with him about Jesus' life. He just didn't like any of the miracles, which it ends on a dour note. And they were terrified. And so that was one answer. The Stoics had another answer, and the Stoics argued that the texts actually hide things. That beneath the plain reading of the text are various kinds of allegories and metaphors and deeper meanings. And the Stoics argued that these deeper meanings can be mined out if you understood philosophy correctly. Well, what basically I think is interesting about Origin is that he takes that method and applies it to the Bible. Because in the Bible, there's also salacious, crazy things about God being jealous and killing people and all kinds of wacky stuff. And so you have to do something with all that. And what do you do with it? You interpret it away. All the things you don't like, you interpret them away. Oh, it's a metaphor. You just make it an allegory for something else. And this is really well suited for the New Testament because the New Testament has all kinds of allegories and parables and things in it. Now, Jesus, I love to talk in parables, especially in the Gospel of Mark. And so I think what makes Origen interesting is his ability to apply that to Scripture. What I'll also say about Origen is, I guess I'll say two other things about him that I think are interesting. The one is that I feel bad for him. Not that I'm like, I have a dog in the fight, because I'm not a Christian and I don't really care about orthodoxy, Christian orthodoxy. What I do care about geniuses being thrown under the bus. And Origen, to me, is a genius thrown under the bus of orthodoxy. Because what ends up happening is that Origen is living in a time where no one knows what Christianity is supposed to be, really. It's not like Jesus wrote a book being like, here's how to be a Christian by Jesus. The dude just dies or goes to heaven, and he left everyone else to clean up the mess. And what ends up happening is that people have to basically develop Christianity like building a ship at sea. And what ends up emerging eventually is orthodoxy, right? Orthodoxy emerges. And so once orthodoxy emerges, let's say in the 4th century, anyone who doesn't line up with that prior to that gets basically tossed out. And Origen is one of the crucially sad examples where Origen was a genius.
Yeah.
He developed the Trinity. He helped develop Christian hermeneutics. He developed a ton of stuff that orthodoxy could have never developed without. And
I agree.
Because Origen basically believed in a theory called subordinationism, one of the many flavors of heresy one can have if you're believe about the Trinity incorrectly. Subordinationism is a belief that the Father is primary, the Son is secondary, and the Spirit is tertiary in terms of subordination of power and even ontological status. The Trinity ultimately undid that or got rid of it. There's none of subordinate to the other. But because of this subordinationism position, Origen got thrown under the bus by the Orthodoxy. Now, they didn't want to throw him under the bus completely because Origen obviously had this pride of place. He had done so much work. So what they do, they condemn Origenism and they maintain that Origen was okay. And there's a whole thing about him cutting his testicles off and making himself a eunuch and stuff. There's a debate about whether that's true or not. But at any rate, I feel bad for him because I really admire his genius. And I really dislike when people rely on other people's genius and throw them on the bus because history didn't work out for them. Right. It's just not fair. I want to like scream at the Orthodoxy to be like, it's not fair. Yeah. Origen deserves better than this. And I will say this, if folks want to read Origen, his book on First Principles is one of the best pieces of early proto-Orthodox philosophy, I'd say, theology. It's an amazing book. It really is. It's like one of these books, even as a non-Christian, I'm just really impressed with it. I just like, this guy's a genius. And it just recently got a new translation. So if you don't want to read it in the old Ante-Nicene Fathers translation, which was 1877 or whatever, it's like not a great translation. It just got retranslated. I think I have it over here on my shelf, but it just got reissued and retranslated. And I really recommend anyone interested in early Christian theology to take a look at it because it really is a work of titanic genius, especially when you think about Origen's developing those ideas completely on his own with very little help. He has no apostolic tradition to lean on in a hardcore way. He's having to basically develop Christianity. It's very impressive. So
he doesn't have
really gets my.
I was going to say he doesn't have the well-funded church that's already like set in place post Theodosius. I should say. Like
he was killed. He was killed in one of the Decian persecutions. I mean, he really had a bad time of it.
Wow.
So I really admire him, and I think he deserves, even if you are an Orthodox Christian, he deserves your attention. He deserves your looking at his works. And you don't, even if you're an Orthodox Christian and you really just don't want to, you don't buy subordinationism, fine. Just don't be a subordinationist, but still appreciate the things that the church in Orthodoxy could never have done at some level without his work. So
I agree.
So yeah, I'm not. Again, I don't have a dog in the fight, but what I don't like to see is people being mistreated because of the accident of history. That doesn't feel good to me.
Take it for granted as well.
Yeah.
Number 5. Yeah. Number 5 is, can you speak more of the topic of daemonification in antiquity, especially how it applied to the thought of Plotinus? And that is the last one from the from the Patreons. We'll get to the super chats.
Yeah. So I'm not quite sure if demonification, you're meaning like the process by which non-Christian entities were turned into demons in the process of the development of orthodoxy, or like people becoming daemons, the existence of daemons, which are, say, daemons are neutral non-divine beings in
It's like
sort of the
apotheosis,
pagan.
right? It's like an
Yeah,
apotheosis, right?
it could be. So I don't know. I can just say when I don't know, I don't know. I don't know of situations in which people become daemons. I don't think that happens in Greek thinking. I think the daemons are a unique group of either folks maybe know, right, that the word daemon had no negative connotation. In fact, the Greek
Right.
word for happiness, eudaimonia, has the exact same word built into it. And Socrates had the daemon that he talked to, right? That he would go and talk to this daemon. So it had no negative connotation until later in Christianity, where the word demon eventually becomes sort of attached to the malevolent. All the beings just become malevolent.
Yeah, right.
So they could be that process, and also Elaine Pagels talks about how about the development of the devil really had a lot to do, in her opinion, about the sort of demonization of Judaism. That's an interesting line of thinking that she has in her book on the devil. In the thought of Plotinus, I guess I just don't know what you're referencing. If you're talking about the process of demonification, which is to say that supernatural beings being demoted to demons in the process of the rise of Christianity, because that doesn't really happen in Plotinus so much. But there are daemons in Neoplatonism, which is to say there are neutral spirits, beings that exist in the Neoplatonic worldview. That are sort of downstream of the one, and those beings get a lot of play in later Neoplatonism, especially Iamblichus, where you can interact with them and stuff like that. But I'm not quite sure exactly what the theurgy and stuff like that. I'm not quite sure what beings are being asked about and where in Plotinus.
Well, I can always go back and ask them to tell us what exactly they mean by that, and we could do it the next time. Rather than answer it and not even know what we're answering. You know what I mean? But thank you for that. And we'll get back to you on Patreon and Messenger. And we'll just go over what the question means and re-ask it for next time.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next one is from Oflemio. Thank you for the super chat. Have you read Fictional Theism by Roy Sorensen? I haven't.
Never heard of it. I'm sorry. I hate when people give super chat money, and especially on my channel too. Sometimes people will super chat me, and they're like, "Have you heard this?" I'm like, "No."
Might be the greatest book of all time.
It could be. I wish there was a way to like refund, for if I don't know the answer to your question, or I can't give you a good answer to be able to. I don't know. So I hate to say, Oflemio. I have not read it.
Me neither.
I don't know anything about it. Sorry.
I'll check. I'll look it up after this is over if I remember. Maybe it's something that interests me out. But Fictional Theism, who knows? Might be the greatest book of all time for all we know.
Yeah, I think most fiction, most theism is fictional, but okay.
Good point. Good point. All right, the next one is from Melody Joy. Thank you for the $2.99 super chat. I always appreciate you. I love seeing you in the chat. She's been there since I was in less than 1,000 subscribers.
Now, don't you love those people, man?
Yes,
people that really stick around. Yeah,
yes.
I got people. The channel's up at around 145K now, and there are people that've been there the entire time. It's just those people to death.
You can never forget those names that you see from the beginning. You'll never forget them.
Absolutely, just super appreciative of those folks.
Yeah, Sabra Boswit. No question, just appreciation for a great discussion. Hey, thank you for that. I really appreciate it. You guys have been really great with these super chats. Appreciate it. I can't express how much I appreciate it. Let's see. I think there was one more. Oh, here we go. Gaius Windex, another regular in the chat. Who do you think influenced the first temple Jews the most, Egyptians or Babylonians?
Interesting. Yeah, so I would say that there weren't first temple Jews. There were first temple Israelites. Jews don't really come into existence until later in some ways. So who's influencing who the most? I would say that if we look at the literature, right? If we look at sort of the literature we have of ancient Israel, I would say that the literature to me looks a lot more Mesopotamian. And what I mean by that is, if you look at the general tenor of Egyptian literature, it's pretty optimistic. The Egyptian worldview is pretty optimistic, and they have the afterlife and things like that. It's a relatively optimistic worldview. And if you look, generally speaking, at the Mesopotamian cultures, those are pretty pessimistic cultures. I mean, there are reasons that scholars have given why they think they are. In fact, I tend to agree that it has to do with the hydraulic nature of their civilizations, whereas the Nile floods regularly. And it's a relatively common source of replenishing the land, and you have a really highly regular society, whereas the Tigris and Euphrates flood randomly. You just have a chaotic society the entire time. That the worldview of those peoples is going to reflect the relative amount of chaos in their world. And the Egyptians have a relatively stable world, all things told, and the Mesopotamian civilizations have a relatively unstable world, all things told. So that's reflected in their literature and their theology, etc. I do think I tend to agree with that. So when you look at the actual literature, to me, it looks really Mesopotamian. For instance, the pessimism of the book like Kohelet, the pessimism of Job. I mean, I think it's really important. For instance, if you want to read Job, you should always read Job by taking the two bookends off that were added later and just not reading them.
Wow, really?
Yeah. So the bookends that you see in Job were added later.
What are those?
The sections about where the Satan and God are having a conversation and betting about it. Those sections we can tell linguistically they're added later.
How later do you think?
I'd probably say centuries later.
Wow.
And the center part of Job, where it's just Job's friends having the conversation with him. That's the earlier strata of that book. If you read, and also the Elihu part is also added in later, probably we think too. We don't think that was original to the text.
So it's like a rolling text.
Yeah, it's all these texts are very rolling text. I mean, they're sort of I think I give the example of you should never think of the Bible as a sheet composed all at one time with one system of weaving. You should think of the Bible as a quilt, where it's just a bunch of stuff patched together. It's a quilt, not a sheet. And so I think it's much better to think of it as a quilt with things stitched together. And it's much clearer if you read Hebrew, where you can see, oh yeah, that Hebrew is nothing like this part. Like, you're reading along and like, oh yeah, this part of Hebrew is really archaic, so archaic that there's no definite article yet.
You know what? Another scholar pointed out to me, it's like, imagine reading English and you go from like someone with like using slang from like a city, someone from the city using slang. All of a sudden, you're talking to someone from like Shakespearean English.
Yeah,
and he goes from one part to the next, and you can tell. Hebrew, you can just tell right away.
Oh yeah, it's really apparent. You're like, oh yeah, this is really different. Yeah. Reading Esther is very different. And so anyway, Job is that reads a lot like, we have other literature like that from Babylon. We have literature it's called pessimism literature. We have a bunch of it from Babylon. I would say that the cultural influence is primarily flowing from the Mesopotamian, and I say Mesopotamian because Babylon, Assyria, Sumeria, those are all sort of coming and going, and even then, the Marian culture and whatever, those cultures are coming and going.
Sure.
And so when we look at the flood myth, right, we see that as a Babylonian story, right? It's coming out of the epic of things like the Epic of Gilgamesh and stuff. So I would say that the flow goes that way. Now, I think there's a reason for that at some level, and part of the reason for that is that Canaan spent a lot of its history under Egyptian rule. For instance, the people often have this weird idea, and I think about this in Passover, right? That the ancient Israelites left Egypt and they crossed the Red Sea or whatever, and they were in the ruin, or in the outskirts of the Promised Land. Yeah, I mean, if you were to leave the Red Sea and go and you look at this map, right? And this is right around the Battle of Kadesh, right? So this is 13th century. So this is roughly the time period in which allegedly the exodus would have happened. You wouldn't have left Egypt.
Right.
You would have still been in these. You would have been walking past Egyptian garrison towns. So it's not like they left Egypt. It's like saying like, oh yeah, like I left Michigan, now I'm out of the United States of America. Welcome to the Promised Land. Like, no, you're still in the Egyptian Empire. This doesn't make any sense. Like,
yeah.
In Merneptah, there's the son of Merneptah, the son of Ramses II. He brags about destroying. It's the earliest mention we have of Israel. in their historical record is bragging about them being destroyed on the Merneptah stele. So,
And by the way, this right here, you can see the Egyptian Ankh on the right.
oh yeah, there's lots of Egyptian. A lot of the royal symbols from the Judean kings are mimicking Egyptian stuff because that's who they were under the thumb of for a long
Yeah.
time. Scarabs and stuff. You see a lot of, even on Hezekiah, the Israelite of the Israelites. You see this this Egyptian iconography. So I think that from a literary point of view, I would say that the influence is primarily Babylonian or Mesopotamian, but from the bureaucratic point of view, I would say it's actually Egyptian. That the state building apparatus, the bureaucratic apparatus looks much more Egyptian, and probably the religious apparatus I think would also probably tend to look more Egyptian. And it's not surprising that when we look at the Yahweh shrines that survive, which we do have a couple that survive, at least the remnants of them, Tel Arad, Tel Dan. When we look at those Yahweh shrines, they look a lot like Egyptian shrines. Right. So I think that, again, from a religious bureaucratic point of view, the influence looks Egyptian, but from the literary point of view, it looks Mesopotamian. And we shouldn't be surprised, right? Because they're sandwiched in between these two peoples, and that's why that's why the Israelite ride is not going to be an easy one. It's going to be a bumpy ride the entire way through, because everybody and their mother wants to control the Shvelah, and the Shvelah is the main trade route that's going to unite that entire region, and everybody and their mother wants it, and you best believe that it's going to be a nightmare for anyone who wants to build a state right in the middle of it, and the Israelites are going to have to deal with that nightmare.
Yeah, that's a good point. And before I get to the last super chat, and if I'm not mistaken, isn't there still a translation? I think it's the Catholic Bible where that actually mentions a pharaoh in the Proverbs somewhere. I could be wrong though.
It could be. I mean, I think the Bible doesn't like to name pharaohs for whatever reason, so it never names Ramses. Or I don't think.
Yeah, it doesn't say pharaoh. It just says like Amenhotep or something.
It could be. Yeah, I think in one of the proverbs, because one of the proverbs is actually taken directly from an Egyptian wisdom, a piece of wisdom literature.
Yeah.
So yeah, folks may. One of the things that often people don't know is that the Egyptians produced a lot of literature, like the instructions of Ptahhotep or other kinds of texts. There's lots of fiction and ghost stories and stuff like this. So, but yeah, the whoever composed Mishlei, Proverbs, was happy to take from other wisdom literature. And we have wisdom literature from Mesopotamia, like the instructions of Shurappak, which, by the way, is probably along with the Keshem, is probably the oldest piece of literature that survives at all.
Wow.
And so we have the instructions of Shurappak and the Keshem. And well, on the Egyptian side, we have the instructions of Amenhotep and the instructions of Ptahhotep. Yep. So we have these texts that have survived, and the learned Israelite society would have known about them. They were famous, and they would have known about them, and would have quoted them.
Or what about eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth?
Yeah, I mean, that's from the Hammurabi law. Yeah.
But it makes sense that that's what you would get from a place that's kind of sandwiched in between these two giant empires.
Right. And again, people have to understand that ancient Israel was tiny.
Yeah.
Like this is not a major world power. This is the only image that we have of an Israelite king at all is King Yehu bowing in prostration to an Assyrian warlord.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the only depiction we have of an Israelite king in all of history.
Even in the time of Herodotus, which is 5th century, I think, BC, he talks about going into Egypt, and he talks about going into Syria, and it's like he just goes. He doesn't even mention Israel. It's like he's like you said, he's still in Egypt.
It's just a tiny little. It's a tiny polity. Now it did get some power, I think, briefly under the Amrides. I tend to agree with Finkelstein that under the Amrides they were an international player, but that's primarily because Egypt and Mesopotamia are having civilization problems. Right. It's not in the Aramean empires are having problems. So it's not like they exist in the vacuum of other power. And as soon as these other powers get their act together, well, the maximal extent of Israelite sovereignty probably was achieved under Jeroboam II. And that's still, if you look at it on a map, that's not much. And it quickly was evaporated once the Assyrians got the Egyptians and the Assyrians got their feet together, got back on their feet. And even kings that were enormously popular, like, I don't know, Josiah, it's a classic example. The Bible bends over backwards to praise him, and he just gets murdered, gets killed in the battle with the Egyptian Necho II. I think Necho II or King Necho, Pharaoh Necho. That's it. Like I think he believed his own BS. I think he wrote out that day thinking Yahweh was going to have his back. And I always tell people, when your battle strategy is God's going to fix it, go home.
Yeah, the Dead Sea Scrolls tells us that too.
Oh yeah, yeah. And the Yachad absolutely went out believing that they were going to get their ass whooped until the very end, and then the guy was going to come in the middle of the night and fix it all. And they just got slaughtered.
Yeah.
And their scrolls sat in those caves, right? I think the Romans took a couple of them hostage, dragged them back to those caves, and when it found out there was no gold there, they ripped up what they could find and left it. And I think that's part of the reason why those scrolls are in such bad shape in a lot of ways. The Romans were pissed.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, again, this is whether it's true of the Yachad or whether it's the battle of Frankenhausen with Thomas Müntzer, when he was like, God's going to fix this. No, if that's your battle plan, you go home.
Yeah.
Go
and
home.
And by the way, Israel Finkelstein, anything he says, I take seriously. I think he's one of the best scholars ever.
I think I like him too, and I would ring the bell of the low chronology. I think William Dever has a better. I think William Dever actually argues. I think he argues conclusively that the low chronology is wrong. I don't like to admit that because I was like the guy ringing the bell on the low chronology, but I think William Dever's new book, and for folks who don't want to read the big 800 tome book, which is Beyond the Texts, which is I think one of the best books of about biblical archaeology written in the past 30 years.
Really, what is it called?
Beyond the Texts by Dever.
Okay. I'll have to get it then.
There's a shorter version of it that he's basically published a summary of it just recently that I can look it up if you want, Neil. That's you can read it in a weekend. It reads way faster, and it's just basically a summary of the 800-page book. So for folks out there who don't want to read the 800-page tome Beyond the Text, you can take a look at his new book that just came out. That's basically a summary of it. And Dever, I think, pretty conclusively puts the nail in the coffin of the low chronology. I was convinced that I am now convinced that Finkelstein's wrong about that. I didn't want to believe it, but I think the low chronology is incorrect.
Hey, I'll take your word for it. I mean, this is what you do. So
it's not actually. I mean, in some ways, I focus on. I'm interested in this stuff, but I'm a scholar of it, and so it's one of those things where I want to be well versed in it, and
sure.
I really try to take positions that I think are reasonable.
Yeah.
And then when I get better data, you gotta be. If you're not willing to change your mind, you need to go home.
You can't just be an Israel Finkelstein dogmatist.
No, exactly. No, exactly. Only Israel Finkelstein can be that.
Yeah. Mitch Mazarel, this is the last super chat, by the way. Thank you for your time, by the way. Mitch Mazarel, thank you for the super chat. Got here late. It is my imagination, or is there a home alchemy set sitting over on Justice's left shoulder? I could use the gold.
Yeah, it's just it's not really a home alchemy set. It's just a small distillation apparatus. I use it to do various little tinkering experiments. I'm definitely no chemist, but there are some things that the alchemists can do that I've been interested in recreating. One of the things I've done is the first process in historical alchemy was extracting liquid mercury from cinnabar. Mercury rarely ever occurs naturally in liquid form. It's almost always bound up in another element called cinnabar, which I have some on my shelf over there. And extracting the liquid mercury from cinnabar is a pretty difficult thing to do using historical alchemical techniques. And so I'm interested in recreating some of that stuff, and so I've done that. Not with that little vessel. You could do that with that. That would be a bad idea. But that's what I basically use this for is you can take that, and if at the end of the night there's a half a bottle of wine left over, you can throw it in there, and that will drip some brandy at the end of it.
Wow, interesting. Not
very good brandy, but
yeah, it's still fun to do though.
Still fun, yeah. It's neat. I mean, it's neat when you can kind of see chemical changes, and I'm not a scientist, but I'm endlessly fascinated by the nature of nature, and so I have a great deal of awe and respect for nature and seeing how we can harness that power, especially if we do it responsibly.
That's the point of science.
Yeah, it fills me with awe, and Aristotle famously said that all philosophy begins in awe, and so the more that I can cultivate that sense of awe
Yeah.
through science or philosophy or religion. I think the better person I become, and more humble and more appreciative to live in the world.
I was reading an article about how they're like trying to mimic how bees like fly and all that stuff, and trying to make little mechanical bees, and
Mhm.
like there's all types of projects going on where they're trying to, what they're doing is they're looking at nature and saying, if we can mimic this, then we can also do this, this, and this. It's
No,
like,
yeah.
it's mind blowing.
Yeah, I mean, lightning bugs or fireflies. One of the interesting, cool things about fireflies is that they create the amount of light they generate. They can generate more light per lumen at a lower temperature than anything else we know of. So usually, when we make light, we make heat, but they can make a very bright light with generating very little heat, which is just a really cool thing that they can do.
Yeah.
So, I remember growing up, like, capturing lightning bugs and seeing them, and now I see them with a different eye. I'm like, oh wow, they're a marvel of nature. They can create more light without creating heat than we know how to do. So I think we should be. I don't think it ever hurts you to be too humble and to know that you don't know, and then to cultivate that humility in the wake of awe, and
Absolutely.
then learn from there.
Absolutely. Anything else you want to say before we end this?
No, man, I'm super glad to you to bring me on, and appreciate the super chats. And folks, come check out Esoterica. My channel is about the academic study of strange things: alchemy, Kabbalah, magic, the occult.
Yeah.
And so it's a place where you can see a scholarly academic study of this stuff, whereas most studies of these materials are dominated by crazy people and conspiracy theories. We don't entertain any of that over at Esoterica. It's a scholarly look at the world of the obscure, the world of the arcane, the world of the mysterious in many ways. So I think that if folks are interested in that, come check out Esoterica. Let us see over the channel.
It's one of the best out. You and Religion for Breakfast and Angela Puka, by the way, who I'm having on next week. She's very underrated. I think she deserves a lot more subscribers.
I totally agree.
But yeah, channels that you guys are putting out there are like priceless, because you don't have to go to a university and pay thousands of dollars. You could just type in Esoterica and click on a video and watch, and you can learn so much.
Yeah, and there's only one degree grant. I say this: there's only one degree granting institution in the world that studies this stuff.
Yeah.
And so it's not just that it's hard to find in general, but even if you did want to go get a degree, you have to pack your bags and move to Amsterdam, which is what I did.
Wow.
So it's not just that you just can't get the material in most places. So it's a lot of fun to make, and also it's also great to get to meet awesome people like you and Derek, and get to be introduced to your great audiences. And so it's just a lot of fun to have conversations like this. So I really appreciate the time that everyone took to come join the live stream.
Absolutely. And then, just like I said, subscribe to Esoterica, and you have just attained true gnosis.
You have just attained true gnosis. The demiurge has no power over you.